Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we're going to explore the topic of who is a philosopher. With me is philosopher Jason Reza Jorjani. He's on the faculty of the New Jersey Institute of Technology, and he is the author of several books, including Prometheus and Atlas, World State of Emergency, and a new anthology of 20 essays on great philosophers called Lovers of Sophia. Welcome, Jason.
It's a great pleasure to be with you again, Jeffrey.
It's a pleasure to be with you as well. Philosophy, frankly, seems to have lost its way. I've heard one philosopher put it this way, that they spend too much time thinking about the meaning of meaning rather than the meaning of life. Is that your opinion?
Yes, it's because the various empirical sciences have disintegrated from out of philosophy to the point where philosophy as a distinct discipline has been construed as an analysis of linguistic meaning, an analysis of the propositions used in various specialized sciences.
Like almost a subdivision of logic or something.
That's right, a handmaiden of the sciences, as it were.
And that's not how philosophy originated. I mean, the very word philosophy means the love of wisdom, does it not?
That's right. I think this is a fundamental betrayal of the purpose of philosophy and of what it means to be a philosopher.
And I guess one might say it's a process that has occurred gradually. I mean, philosophy as a discipline is maybe the oldest of all academic disciplines.
Yes, I mean, the inception of philosophy, in a sense, is contemporaneous with the founding of the academy. Of course, the first academy was the Academy of Plato. Perhaps you could see the Pythagorean order as a predecessor to an extent.
Yeah.
But you're right that this has been a gradual process. However, it's been a gradual process that's only really taken place over the last couple of hundred years.
Because prior to maybe 300 years ago, people who engaged in science were considered natural philosophers.
Yes, even less than 300 years ago, because Descartes, Galileo, and Newton were all referred to as philosophers. It's really only in the 1800s that physics first breaks away from philosophy, defines itself as a distinct field of human activity, let's say. And this was really an insult leveled by certain philosophers against others. By defining themselves as physicists, the word physics goes back to the word for nature in Greek, physis. These philosophers who had adopted materialism and mechanistic reductionism were trying to say to the other philosophers, we're the only ones who really have a handle on what nature is. The rest of you are just basically trading in mere opinions and speculation. So the first of the sciences to distinguish itself from philosophy is physics in the early 1800s. And then subsequently biology was established as a distinct discipline. And the last of the major branches of philosophy to differentiate itself as an empirical science was psychology, sometime in the late 19th century, early 20th century.
You might say that William James was perhaps the last philosopher-psychologist.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, it's sad that this has happened. In a way, it's as if philosophy has lost its way.
It's more than sad. It's a catastrophe because although I just mentioned the empirical sciences, it's also the case that what we refer to as political science was a branch of philosophy until the 20th century. Political philosophy is what we now refer to as political science. I mean, Aristotle and Plato were political scientists to refer to their contemplation of justice in a rather anachronistic fashion.
And yet, on the other hand, I think it's fair to say that if science had not become specialized, we wouldn't have seen all the progress that we've. I mean, the last 150 years have shown just incredible transformations in human society due to science.
That's a fair point. In order to make concrete breakthroughs in the sciences and also in technological applications of scientific discovery, you need to demarcate a more focused realm of problems. And you need to assume a certain framework of knowledge, what we call a paradigm. Without that, you can't advance specific theories or test distinct hypotheses. However, it's not the case that Aristotle was unaware of this. Aristotle drew a distinction between people who work in episteme, what we would call science, and people who are seekers of noesis, or who are operating, contemplating in the realm of noesis. So, you can have...
You could define noesis.
Well, higher intellectual contemplation of abstract concepts and fundamental principles. Whereas episteme is the acquisition and classification of knowledge. So it isn't as if there were not specialized researchers in the time of Aristotle. They just wouldn't have been considered philosophers.
I mean, there were, I suppose, geographers.
Sure, but Aristotle conducted dissections of biological organisms in his laboratory. He also ran political science think tanks, and he had people employed in those, writing the constitutions of various Greek city-states on contract. Not all of those people employed by Aristotle at his think tanks would have been considered philosophers. What we've lost is that type of activity that's synthetic and that has the capacity to encompass what we've differentiated as all of the fields of scientific inquiry, and to call into question the fundamental framework in terms of which various types of scientific research take place.
Well, in addition to science having disassociated itself from philosophy, you have branches of philosophy now where typically, I think, if you get hired in academia, you're expected to be a specialist in ontology or political theory or epistemology or the ancient Greeks or some other particular branch of philosophy. Very few generalists any longer.
That's right. The branches of philosophy are metaphysics or ontology. And by the way, before I go on to the other ones, let me just point out that this term metaphysics, that has such a mysterious connotation these days, and that's been dismissed by many analytic philosophers, has a very mundane origin. When they were trying to classify the writings of Aristotle, there was a set of texts that wasn't really physics, and it was sort of left over after all of the other classifications, including biology and psychology. Aristotle wrote treatises on biology and psychology. And so they called this the stuff after physics, or stuff beyond physics, metaphysics. Really, it's not at all distinct from ontology. And so what ontology is the logic of being. It concerns questions about the ultimate nature of reality and the fundamental principles of the cosmos. A contemplation of nature, including human nature. Then epistemology concerns the theory of knowledge, what it means for something to be knowledge rather than mere opinion. And of course, this was the starting point for philosophy in the classical Greek society around the time of Socrates. Socrates is depicted by Plato in his dialogues as someone who's constantly challenging the arbitration of mere opinion, the decision-making in terms of political life, in terms of the good, sacred ideals and so forth, on the basis of mere opinion, where anyone and everyone thinks that essentially they're qualified to pass judgments on these questions. So epistemology goes all the way back to Plato's attempt to demarcate knowledge as distinct from opinion, truth as something distinct from mere semblance. And then we have ethics, and which is relatively self-explanatory, let's just say provisionally for the moment. And we have politics, and ideally one's politics, one's political philosophy should be grounded in one's understanding of ethics. Finally, there's aesthetics. And this is not something trivial at all, because, it could be argued that the ethical life can only be properly comprehended on the basis of aesthetic judgment. That basically the way one weaves the fabric of one's ethos or character requires aesthetic judgment. And then again, that's reflected in a certain political theory or another, in a certain political constitution. So these are the main branches of philosophy. And as you said, it's expected that you specialize in one or another one these days in academia. But that's defeating the fundamental purpose and calling of a philosopher, which is to be able to contemplate truth, beauty, and justice in an integral fashion as one seeks greater wisdom and understanding.
Mm-hmm. Now, some philosophers, I interviewed Pierre Grimes not long ago, who was a specialist in ancient Greek philosophy, and he felt that for a philosopher to contemplate what is good, what is true, what is beautiful, actually, in Platonic thought, requires them to achieve a state of higher consciousness, a state of enlightenment, not so different from the Vedantic philosophers of India.
That's right. So I would say that any philosopher needs to be someone who is seeking enlightenment, seeking some higher spiritual state. Mm-hmm. And yet, not everyone seeking a higher spiritual state, and not everyone who sets themselves up as a guru who can offer others a path to such a spiritual state is legitimately describable as a philosopher.
Sure.
So all those seeking enlightenment are not philosophers, but any philosopher has to be someone seeking enlightenment. And this is another way in which we can see the difference between a scientist and a philosopher, or a mere political theorist and a political philosopher.
Well, in the history of philosophy, there are great philosophers. I don't think anybody would challenge the notion that Aristotle was a philosopher. He's practically the archetypal philosopher.
That's right, and I would assert that one of the criteria of determining who are the legitimate philosophers throughout the course of the past 2,500 years is whether their thought elaborates revolutionary ideas with respect to the nature of truth, beauty, and justice. In other words, they have to be thinking across all of what we now have defined as these various subdivisions of philosophy.
Why revolutionary? I mean, some great philosophers basically just elaborating on the work of others. I believe Nietzsche, for example, borrowed a great deal from Spinoza.
He did, but he defined new concepts that went beyond the thought of Spinoza or any other of his predecessors. And I would say this invention of concepts is characteristic of any true philosopher. You really have to discover new ideas. And of course, this by itself is a controversial philosophical question. Are you intuiting ideas that already exist, that are in some kind of Platonic realm of forms? Or is a philosopher, as Nietzsche would be more inclined to see it, a creator, an artist of concepts that can organize knowledge in new ways? So, I would say that the revolutionary activity of the philosopher is to invent or to discover concepts that were hitherto unthinkable, and thereby bring about revolutions both in the sciences. So I would see philosophical discoveries, philosophical concepts as the point of origin for all scientific revolutions. And also to bring about revolutions in the political sphere based on the elaboration of new concepts.
In other words, well, one philosopher who has influenced me, I don't know if you would consider him a philosopher, Rudolf Steiner. I think you would.
He's a tough case.
Yeah.
He's a tough case.
He's probably more of a mystic than a philosopher.
Possibly.
But in any case, he raised the idea that a concept itself is a spiritual entity, that concepts have force. Concepts, it's as if, when a concept goes from one mind to another mind, it becomes autonomous in some sense.
I'd be inclined to agree with that.
So that's the realm in which philosophers are ideally addressing.
That's right. And again, I mean, that's a profoundly unsettling activity, which is why I call it revolutionary. You know, the careers of tens, in our world, hundreds and hundreds of people are invested in the survival of a particular scientific paradigm.
Yep.
And these scientific paradigms, like, for example, the Cartesian paradigm, are based on philosophical concepts. The Cartesian paradigm is grounded in Descartes' concept of res extensa, or a mathematically analyzable extended substance. And so, you know, whether it's threatening the careers of tens of scientists who have established methodologies for their research, or whether it's perhaps the more significant threat to established political systems on account of new political concepts like natural right, which was at the ground of the French and American revolutions, and, you know, was a concept elaborated by thinkers like the Marquis de Condorcet or Immanuel Kant. In any case, the discovery of philosophical concept is a revolutionary activity.
Well, in your opinion, who is the most recent thinker who you would consider a real philosopher?
Martin Heidegger.
Who died, as I recall, in the 1960s or so.
Yeah, there are a set of new concepts in Heidegger's thought, like being towards death, like three different modalities of history, the finitude of human existence, that you don't find in previous thinkers, and that could become the basis, I would say, both for scientific revolutions and political ones. In my own work in Prometheus and Atlas, I've adopted and adapted certain elements of Heidegger's thought with a specific view to catalyzing a scientific revolution.
Well, many people are familiar with Sartre, the French philosopher who, as I understand it, built on Heidegger's ideas. Would you consider him a philosopher?
I would, although I believe that Sartre misinterpreted Heidegger's concept of existence. So to some extent he's dependent on Heidegger, and to the extent his ideas are original, they also involve the misinterpretation of a previous philosopher. However, whatever particular criticisms I may have of Sartre, Sartre is someone who elaborated not just an ontology, mainly in being and nothingness, and also an epistemology in that book, but someone who thought seriously about politics, someone who definitely has a political philosophy, and who was an aesthetician in practice, who not only had an aesthetic theory, but applied it through the many novels that he wrote. So I would definitely consider Sartre a philosopher.
Oh, okay. Well, since the deaths of Heidegger and Sartre, I'm guessing there must be 40, 50,000 people working around the world as professional philosophers today.
Yes. See, what's happened is there's been this bifurcation between postmodern philosophy that's a descendant of the continental European tradition, in which both Heidegger and Sartre are situated, and an Anglo-American analytic school. I can't call it a tradition because it radically rejects the idea of tradition. So there's this bifurcation. And I would describe both postmodern European philosophy or postmodern continental philosophy and contemporary analytic Anglo-American philosophy as in some way post-philosophical. I mean, they have rejected the essential idea of philosophy or the core duty of a philosopher. In the case of postmodernism, I don't think it's necessary simply because you're intent on carrying out deconstruction of the tradition to abandon the calling of a philosopher. After all, the concept of deconstruction is one of the concepts that is discovered by Martin Heidegger. And there's a way of deconstructing the history of ontology, as Heidegger put it, that could revitalize the philosophical tradition and take it in a new direction. But that isn't what's been done by the majority of so-called postmodern thinkers in the continental tradition.
Let's go back for a moment to the ancient Greek idea of noesis, which I'm equating with kind of a higher state of consciousness or enlightenment. Was that part of Heidegger's thought or Sartre's thought?
It's harder to see it in Sartre. I do think it's there. It's there in practice, insofar as Sartre is exercising noesis when he writes being and nothingness. The type of cognitive functioning at work in composing a text like that is most definitely what Aristotle would call noesis. It is a capacity to think in terms of abstract principles and develop new fundamental frameworks for knowledge, rather than working in a pre-existing framework and carrying out specialized research on that basis.
I mean, when I think of it, just the title, Being and Nothingness, it gives one the impression that he's talking about forms of awareness or cognition that transcend even the notion of being human.
Well, what Sartre does, the way in which he exercises this faculty of noesis, despite its differences in specific content, is formally very much the same as what Heidegger does in Being and Time. And that's an attempt to carry out a phenomenological analysis of human existence. What that means is to attend to the phenomena evident in being human, to notice delineations of the structure of human experience that are so fundamental that they persist or underpin different frameworks of knowledge. So to be able to bracket your assumptions that are based on one or another paradigm, and to proceed with an analysis of the fundamental structure of our existence.
In effect, what you're saying is that the purpose of this type of philosophy is to question things that people have never questioned before. That we assume some things at such a deep, maybe unconscious level that, like, well, for example, the nature of space and time. Most people deal with space and time as givens, not as anything to be questioned.
Indeed. And, if you want to see a striking example of that kind of questioning, one ought to look at the extreme changes in artistic styles that took place from the 19th century through the 20th century in the successive artistic movements like Impressionism and Dadaism, Surrealism, Abstract Expressionism. Georg Hegel, in his Phenomenology of Spirit, advanced the view that these changes in artistic style were indicative of an evolution of human consciousness.
Hegel?
Hegel. Yeah, Hegel in the Phenomenology of Spirit.
But now he wrote, 150, 200 years ago?
That's the genius. He anticipated this. To the extent that he was looking back to classical art and seeing the difference between classical Greek art and its predecessors in Egyptian culture, Assyrian, Babylonian culture, and then its successors in terms of medieval European art, and then Renaissance and early modern art. He developed a theory about how the evolution of human consciousness through a successive series of stages and the increasing rationalization and self-consciousness of the human mind would be reflected in changes in artistic styles and in the aesthetic of a civilization. So, that's an example of how philosophical thought also takes the form of aesthetics. Now, Hegel is someone who would have analyzed these changes in art aesthetic style in terms of more fundamental changes in the structure of cognition. He was a rationalist. Whereas somebody like Nietzsche argues that ultimately our fundamental criteria for developing new systems of knowledge and our judgments about how to live an ethical life and the changes in our fundamental values ultimately are based on aesthetic intuition. Regardless of which of these views is correct, in either case, both Hegel and Nietzsche are philosophers because they understand the integral relationship between art and science and politics, between truth, beauty, and justice.
Well, now in the last 50 years, amongst the, I'm guessing, 40 to 50,000 professional philosophers, surely there must be some who have this same view, who are embodying the true spirit of philosophy as it was originally conceived. I mean, I consider you such a person.
You know, I think that we certainly in the West, and much of the history of philosophy is coextensive with the history of Western, intellectual life. We in the West are facing a grave civilizational crisis. And I think you could see that crisis in terms of the disintegration of philosophy. So the question of whether our civilization survives and can undergo another renaissance is to some extent the same as the question of whether philosophy has any future.
Well, I would imagine that pretty much every university in the world has a philosophy department.
Sure, it does. But, again...
as opposed to my field of study, parapsychology, where there are none.
Yeah, but as with the decline of the Roman Empire, the late years of the Roman Empire, we saw a proliferation of philosophical schools, the Epicurean school, the Stoic school, and so forth. So you had academic institutions which taught philosophy. But the question is, did they really produce philosophers? And I would say, I'm not the first person to observe that you had a decline in real philosophical thought in the late Roman Empire, and it presaged our collapse into the Middle Ages. And it took hundreds of years for philosophy to be revitalized.
Well, there is sort of the old saying regarding medieval philosophers that they spent all their time trying to contemplate how many angels could dance on the head of a pin.
That's right. I would say in the medieval period, the center of philosophy moves from Europe to Iran, to the Persianate world, and to some extent also to northern India. People like Abhinavagupta in northern India demonstrate an extraordinarily wide range of thought and fundamental questioning in all areas, including aesthetics. And in Iran, you see some significant efforts of political philosophy that's grounded in ontology and epistemology during the medieval period. And people like Al-Farabi, or Al-Biruni. The problem with Abu Rayhan Biruni or Abu Nasr Farabi is that they tend to have a view of wisdom that's perennialist. They believe in an eternal, unchanging storehouse of truths, which, once it's unlocked by any given sage, can simply be dispensed to the followers of that sage through their diligent apprenticeship and study under him. And
that's a view that's held today by some philosophers.
It is. For example, the most recent major so-called philosopher who held that view is Julius Evola, Italian philosopher of the mid-20th century, who wrote many, many books in various areas, including aesthetics and politics, not just ontology. But see, the problem with Julius Evola or someone like René Guénon, who are in this line that goes back to Farabi and Biruni, is that they don't have any sense that discoveries are being made, or that there are that there's a burden to challenge established truths. And consequently open up oneself up to the possibility of revolutions, not just in the structure of knowledge, but in the structure of society and in political systems.
But the idea of a primordial tradition or a perennial philosophy, in modern times, I interviewed Houston Smith, recently deceased. To my thinking, a great philosopher, a specialist in the world's religions. And he felt that there was a common thread that ran through all of the world's religions and mystical traditions. And I think Aldous Huxley, a very talented novelist, felt the same way.
Yeah, and Farabi takes this to the extent of saying that essentially in one of his texts he argues Plato and Aristotle are saying the same thing, and that any differences in their metaphysics or in their political philosophy are simply questions of style and expression. I think that's absurd. It's patently false. And the reason Farabi wants to believe this is because to him, uncertainty would itself be a refutation of somebody's status as a knowledgeable individual or someone possessing wisdom, right? But see, philosophy is not the possession of wisdom, it's the love of wisdom. And I would say the Promethean impulse that we associate with bold scientific exploration and discovery is actually the most characteristic feature of philosophy. It's what has survived in science from philosophy. And if one lacks that, one is not a philosopher. Every true philosopher is a Promethean in some sense.
What do you mean by Promethean?
Someone who challenges the established order, someone who challenges the established cosmos of thought, and who re-examines what human nature is in a way that even courts the possibility of political upheaval and rebellion.
Prometheus being the Greek titan who challenged the authority of Zeus by bringing fire to humanity.
Prometheus, who is a rebel against the world order of Olympus. I think, in a sense, every legitimate philosopher has to be that.
Well, coming back to an earlier point about Huston Smith's notion of the primordial tradition, he was referring, I think, only to religion, not necessarily to science at all. And I think Aldous Huxley meant the same in the perennial philosophy. I know that there are postmodern critiques of that idea. And they suggest that, well, we can never know that all the mystics are saying the same thing or not, because every mystic is speaking in a particular cultural language that we from our distance will never quite fathom.
The problem with this position that you're attributing to Huston Smith and these other perennialists who predominantly concern themselves with sages and religious prophets, is that religion is not distinct from philosophy, nor is it safe from philosophy. You can't, and the other thing is, those perennialists in the field of comparative religion or philosophy of religion or whatever you want to call it, tend to see philosophers who are not sages or mystics as subordinate to the ones who are. Whereas what I would say is that going all the way back to Plato, and some of the pre-Socratics like Heraclitus, philosophers have challenged the religious establishment of their own time, almost inevitably. And certainly Nietzsche is another example closer to our own time. The religious ideals of any society are not safe from philosophers. This is why actually Jean-Jacques Rousseau argues that the persecution and execution of Socrates was justified. He as a defender of democracy and of the legitimacy of the general will in any society, argues that to the extent that philosophers are tolerated, they should be forced to keep their more controversial views private and not to express them in the public sphere. Because Rousseau recognized rightly that philosophers are in a way inherently cosmopolitan. They are citizens of the cosmos in the true sense of the word, and they owe no allegiance that you can take for granted to any political system, to any state, or to any established scientific paradigm.
Well, I think if you look at the history of philosophy, there are many, many examples where philosophers come into conflict with political authorities of every stripe. I seem to recall there was one Chinese emperor who executed every philosopher in the kingdom.
It's not the only place where that happened.
So in general, political establishments are threatened by philosophy.
And religious establishments, to go back to what you were saying about Huston Smith and the other perennialists in comparative religion. The problem with them is that they're trying to bring about peace and harmony between all of the as they put it, world religions, by making the false claim that these religions all are grounded on the same set of fundamental claims, or are ultimately different expressions of the same worldview. Whereas the job of a philosopher who has proper discernment is to distinguish between various world religions where they are really saying different things, and to challenge all of them, and to guide humanity spiritually, not just scientifically or politically.
Well, that's a tall order.
Remember that in the Republic, Plato suggests that the philosopher kings ought to be the people designing the religion of the commoners. And so this goes back to the concept of the noble lie in the Republic. Plato recognizes that the rank and file of society, mass man, requires something like religious belief in order to secure social stability. And yet he saw the Homeric Olympian religion of his society as something detrimental to the development of the ethical fabric of children, the ethical fiber of children. So he suggested that the philosopher rulers of the state ought to craft a new religion which consists, in a sense, of noble lies, but these noble lies do constructively guide masses of people toward the cultivation of true virtues.
Now, Plato also, as I understand it, had various other rules for the philosopher kings that separated them from the masses of humanity. As I recall, they couldn't have children, or maybe they lived communally so that they couldn't, their kingship wouldn't be inherited.
That's right. They were not allowed to hold any property, including wives who are their property, or since he viewed women as being capable of leading as philosophers, as statesmen, you could say, the women weren't allowed to have husbands that were their property. And in general, to put it in contemporary terms, these people would not have had private bank accounts. The real significance of this is that it suggests right at the beginning of philosophical history that the philosopher is, in a way, not an ordinary human being. And although Nietzsche, in a sense, is the inversion of Plato, when you look at his thought from a metaphysical or epistemological standpoint, Nietzsche says the same thing. For Nietzsche, the philosopher is the harbinger of the Superman, of a post-human condition. So I think that this is a legitimate observation. I would argue you could even see this in Hegel. Hegel's concept of the evolution of human consciousness toward a utopian society implies that the mind, which is capable of scoping out that whole evolutionary history in advance, is already, in a sense, at the end of history and thinking backwards from it. That's not an ordinary human being.
No, that's a parapsychological concept.
I would agree, actually, yes. And, a lot of people in academia filter Hegel's parapsychological writings when they teach Hegel. But Hegel wrote a great deal about telepathy and precognition and clairvoyance.
Well, perhaps we should close on that note. It's been a fascinating conversation, Jason. Thank you so much.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you, Jeffrey.
And thank you for being with us.